Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Welcome to another episode of Social Housing Around the World. Today we'll be focusing on South Africa. My name is Dominika Krzeminska, and I'm the Director of Programs and Strategic Initiatives at CHRA. Thank you all for joining us. Today we'll hear from Barry Pinsky of Rooftops Canada about Rooftops' social housing and urban regeneration work in South Africa. Barry will then moderate a conversation between Jeff Morrison of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and Malcolm McCarthy of the National Association of Social Housing Organizations in South Africa about the state of and issues and opportunities surrounding social housing in Canada and South Africa. So I'd like to introduce to you our speakers for today. Barry Pinsky has worked for over 30 years in all aspects of low-income housing development, from housing projects in Canada and Africa to municipal and national housing policy in numerous countries. Trained as an architect and urban planner, he is one of the pioneers of the cooperative housing movement in Canada. As executive director of Rooftops Canada, Abri International, he has helped mobilize over $40 million to support overseas housing groups in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. Jeff Morrison is the Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association. Before joining CHRA, Jeff was Associate Director, Federal Affairs in GlaxoSmithKline, and before then served as Director of Government Relations and Public Affairs with the Canadian Pharmacists Association. Jeff is very active in the community. He currently sits on the board of directors of Operation Come Home, Away Home Canada, and chairs the organization of the Ottawa Pride Run. He has also served on the board of directors of Bruce House and as the president of the board of directors of the Centertown Community Health Center. Malcolm McCarthy is general manager at the National Association of Social Housing Organizations of South Africa. He has over 40 years of providing support for development in the field of municipal planning and organizational systems and provision of housing. In South Africa, he has participated in the development and implementation of a number of important programs, including social housing, community residential units, and the National Integrated Development Planning System used as the base for municipal planning. He's also involved in initiating work in the use of social housing as an important catalyst in urban regeneration. He was also deeply involved in research and policy development on land reform in South Africa. Welcome, Barry, Jeff, and Malcolm.
Great. Thank you, Dominika. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everybody. I think we're the evening end. It's early evening here in Johannesburg. Next slide. Can you move the slides? Next slide. There we go. Oh, it all works. Okay. Just a brief word about Rooftops Canada. I'm guessing some of you or all of you know who we are. We're the International Development Program of Social and Co-op Housing Groups in Canada. We've been at this for a long time, 35 years. And in effect, Rooftops Canada is owned by organizations like the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, CHF Canada, and a number of the provincial nonprofit housing associations who make up the majority of the board of Rooftops Canada and contribute to our programs in a whole variety of ways. Next. We partner with a wide variety of actors who engage in housing. Housing organizations, non-government organizations, financial institutions, governments at all levels, international agencies, and so on. And our main focus is on institutional development and capacity building. So we've never actually gone anywhere and built houses. We build organizations that in turn work with very low-income communities on housing development, housing finance, housing-related support services, community and local economic development, and so on. Next slide. In 2020, we'll be celebrating our 35 years. As Dominika mentioned, we've raised something like $30 million to build capacity for housing projects and programs in I think it's actually 38 different countries. A lot of what we do is draw on experienced Canadians to support people in other countries with technical assistance. We've hosted something like 350 or more study visitors in Canada. We think it's only guesswork that we've leveraged over $500 million in housing and economic development activity, and with our partners have helped house tens of thousands of people, tens of thousands of families, so many more people. In South Africa, and I think maybe I'll start, Malcolm, and you'll jump in if I say the wrong things. South Africa was, I'm sure most of you know, under a system called apartheid from 1948 to 1994. And this was a very deliberately white imposed political system that had a spatial dimension. So people were forced to live in parts of the city and parts of the country by their racial background. And many people, tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands probably, were forcibly removed from areas where they were considered not to belong. So there's numerous examples of, some of them are world famous, of struggles against these forced removals, which often meant clearing, and people use terms black, white, colored, Indian. They're politically correct here to use them, so I'm going to use them. So, black people forcibly removed from areas that suddenly were reserved for white people. And so you got a very challenging, spatially divided city that the new government in 1994, which is when Nelson Mandela was elected president and the African National Congress took over the government, inherited this spatially divided city. Divided by color, and often color follows class. So you had a lot of white people living in the best parts of the city, black people living in the worst parts of the city, other groups, colored and Indian, living in sometimes more marginal, not best parts of the city. So there's a huge dimension, and it has implications. Can you go on? Next slide. One thing you have is a lot of people still living in informal settlements or slums, living in shacks that maybe they have built, or in many cases they are renting. And this is an extraordinary photo because this is a sort of shack settlement with $1 million views of Table Mountain, which is the centerpiece of the city of Cape Town. Next, please. One of the main housing programs after 1994 was to give people small houses, fully serviced, roads, water, electricity, sewerage. There's big arguments about the numbers, but I think you can say something like 2 million houses were built, possibly more. There's still a housing backlog of another 2 million households. That's on a population base of, is it 45 million? 58 million. So 2 million households, that's 7 or 8 million people. So it's a pretty major housing backlog. And a lot of those people are living in shacks or in, if you go to the next slide, highly overcrowded inner city buildings, many of which are in pretty serious states of decay, abandoned by their owners, and in lots of cases, hijacked by criminals who run the buildings at the point of guns. But people are so desperate for housing, particularly in inner city and better locations, that those are very crowded and awful buildings. So for the last 4 years, we've been working on a project called Equal Spaces, Social Housing to End Spatial Apartheid. It's a program that's supported by the Government of Canada through Global Affairs Canada. And the whole intention is to provide opportunities in the inner city for people who are excluded, particularly low and moderate income people, who would then have access to better housing, but also access to socioeconomic opportunities, jobs, schools, health facilities, and so on, that don't exist in the sort of sprawling outer ring of apartheid cities. The project, of course, has a capacity building dimension, and we've had people here as long-term advisors working with NASHO, the National Association of Social Housing Organizations, on both the social housing side of things and on the urban regeneration side of things. Okay, next. So maybe Malcolm, this is more your terrain.
Yeah.
The role of social housing in South Africa, and you'll talk a bit about what it is and what NASHO is and what it does.
All right. Hello all. It's quite strange talking to some people who've only just finished breakfast, as we're ready to go out for supper, but it's fun as well. And thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk with you all and interact, I hope. So I want to just mention that NASHO for a long time have had a very strong connection with Canada, certainly, and also with Holland around social housing, and particularly a very strong relationship with Rooftops. And I think it's been an extremely constructive partnership in which I think certainly in South Africa we've learned and developed a lot. But I hope that it's also made some contribution to what goes on in Canada itself. So social housing in South Africa is quite interesting, because for a long time there was a huge resistance to thinking about any forms of government-assisted rental housing. And the whole, as Barry mentioned earlier, the whole emphasis was on ownership. And so we had 2.8 million RDP BMG houses which were built. But the major problem with that was that most of them were built very much on the periphery of our cities and towns and in the rural areas. And because of this, we found that poorer people were being dispersed sometimes even beyond the old apartheid townships. And so in terms of changing their access to resources, access to economic opportunities, it was doing very little. What it was really doing was just giving people a roof over their heads. And so this approach, I suppose, through a lot of policy and other challenges, was starting to be looked at more carefully, and slowly a rental housing movement, a social housing movement began to develop in the country, which did get a lot of support from Holland, England, Canada, and places like that. And it developed slowly until 2004, at which point there was a 2006 social housing policy which was launched. And then after this, and I think this is very significant in the South African context, it actually had its own legislation. And there are not many developmental programs in South Africa that have their own legislation. So that's a very positive. I think the premise, though, is very important to understand. It was developed as a spatial integration program. So the whole intention was to fund rental housing, to try and deal with the spatial inequalities that had developed in South Africa, which Barry referred to earlier. And the means through which this was going to be done was the use of well-managed rental housing run by non-profit social housing institutions, which received a capital subsidy for government. And the target was mainly households whose incomes ranged initially from 1,500 to, sorry, next slide, please. $1,500, Canadian dollars, I assume.
Yeah, I did the
to $1,500. And so these would be people who are on what we call lower and moderate incomes in South Africa. And that's where it is now. It started at up to 1.5 to about 750. Yeah, 750. So, and the premise of the program is that the government invests a capital subsidy which covers between 60 and 70% of the total cost of the units. And then the non-profit social housing institutions need to raise the rest of the capital themselves. A lot of it actually comes from the government housing bank, but the loan terms and conditions are very often no different from what you can get from the private sector banks. And then the balance, so that covers the cost. Most of the SHIs, because they're fairly new and have very limited portfolios, don't have a huge amount of equity, although there are a few that have developed to the point where they are able to do that. And the product in South Africa is very much medium density, so usually 3 to 4 story walk-ups, although we're beginning to explore much higher densities now, particularly in some of the major metro areas, and we'll talk about that together in a little while. At the moment, there are about 36,000 social housing units in the country, which are under management of about 22 social housing institutions. So it's, next slide, please. So this is a little bit about the story of NASHO, which is the organization I'm responsible for. It was founded in 2002, and it's a membership-based organization which has primarily non-profit social housing institutions as its members. And its mission is really to build a strong and sustainable social housing sector in South Africa, with entrepreneurial SHIs at the heart of the delivery. And if we can carry on, I think it's on the next slide. And the major programs we run at the moment are information and publicity about social housing. We do a lot of research. For instance, this year we're doing research on the impact of municipal charges and utility, electricity and water on affordability of rental housing, because there's a lot of distortions within that policy space in South Africa. We use our research most often linked to very practical advocacy work, in which we not only try to change national policy, because that often takes a long time, but we work very much at a municipal level, trying to get shifts in the way municipalities are implementing critical policy areas in their municipal spaces. We also work very hard on the development of new capacity in social housing institutions. I mean, we base it on the idea that they must be as effective and efficient as possible and very responsive. And because of the marginality of the social housing business for a non-profit company, we stress the fact that they do have to be entrepreneurial, and if they're not entrepreneurial, they're never going to actually survive in the climate in South Africa. We provide technical advice and assistance both around the management and the capital development, the capital products, and part of this is to develop innovative pilot programs and projects which can then actually be integrated in practices, and also talks back to policy. So at the moment, the work we've been doing on social housing, urban regeneration, and with Rooftops Canada and Equal Spaces program, both in Cape Town and another municipality called eThekwini. Others of you might know it as Durban. That is now being placed very firmly in the discussions which are presently reviewing the social housing policy which has been undertaken by the National Department of Human Settlements, which is our national housing department. So that's, I hope, a relatively brief introduction. This is an interesting picture. This is just to give you a little bit of a feel of what some of the developments are. This is downtown Johannesburg, and this building you see, which is mainly the yellow mustard type brick part of it, was originally a nurse's home, and then at one stage it was actually what we call in South Africa hijacked buildings. Had been taken over by people, not only people occupying it legally, but by gangsters who were charging other people to actually live there. And once it was taken back, it was developed as a social housing project. And it has something like 620 units, I think. And what's interesting about them, they range from rooms with shared communal facilities right through to 2-bedroom units. And the social housing institution, which has developed this project, has a very interesting concept, which is called the housing ladder. So what they like as social landlords to do is to provide the opportunity for people to move under the same landlord from a basic unit through to a more comfortable unit as their income increases, but at the same time to assist people whose income decreases to continue living in a reasonably managed formal. Because I must just mention that unlike probably certainly Canada and perhaps some of the other listeners, South Africa doesn't have an operational or a subjective subsidy at all for housing. So the social housing program as it stands at the moment is primarily for people who are earning a regular income. And when your income diminishes or you lose a job, it becomes much more difficult for social housing institutions to keep you on in the accommodation. It's a major problem for ourselves, a major struggle as well. So this is run by Medulla Warhorn. You'll have seen that there's a football field there, and linked to that project has been a very famous project, which is called the Ikaya project, which is a neighborhood development which brought together a lot of the landlords in the area and their tenants and their building supervisors to develop a scheme which looks after both the cleanliness and the safety in the neighborhood, but also has developed a whole range of activities, educational, recreational, for young kids, women, and other groupings who are living in the area. And very often that's another characteristic of social housing institutions. They go beyond being a social landlord. They often run extensive neighborhood development and tenant development programs.
Okay, good start. Thank you, Malcolm. I think people are accumulating questions. I hope they are. But I'm going to ask a few questions to you and to Jeff to start things off, and then Dominica is going to let us know what some of the questions are from the other participants. This is going to sound stilted. I apologize. I'm reading the questions. I'm terrible at that. Through the National Housing Strategy Act, my country, Canada, finally has legislation that supports the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. In South Africa, the right to access adequate housing has been in the Constitution, I think, since the end of apartheid.
Apartheid, yes, that's right.
Which is spectacular. Malcolm, could you speak to South Africa's constitutional right to housing? How's it implemented, and how does that affect social housing?
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm certainly not a constitutional expert, so I could be mucky about this particular one. But I think that everybody has a right within our constitution to decent basic housing, and also the right to security of tenure, that is, not to be constantly moved, which is important in the history of South Africa, because Barry, you referred earlier to the number of people who had actually been forced out of places that they were living in because of apartheid, and often left in very barren parts of rural areas. So historically, it's been very, very important. However, there's always, I'm sure, in all countries, a tension between the Constitution, and our Constitution, we're told, is one of the best in the world, and what it's asking for, and the actual reality on the ground and the opportunities. So in a way, part of the intervention has come from government, where government has invested a lot of money in really, I suppose, interventions in the housing market in order to be able to provide housing for people who have not had it. And part of those programs I mentioned before, worship-type programs geared towards the poorest of the poor in South Africa. And that's been relatively successful in terms of numbers delivered and amounts spent. But there are huge questions about whether that investment is substantially changing the life opportunities of those households. So that has then led on to much discussion about how do we use housing as a way of providing the opportunity for people to live in much better located parts of the city and to work as a way of trying to create greater economic integration. And social housing, and I've talked about the policy around that, is one of the instruments that government has created. But I must also say that the other part of the whole issue is around some of the strong advocacy that's done by organizations like SERI in Johannesburg and Kwasi in Cape Town, where there is a strong advocacy around people's rights, around their rights to housing if they face eviction, the restrictions on the conditions around which you can evict people. And I think that's been incredibly important. But what we've got to acknowledge in South Africa is that still the vast majority of poorer Black people are actually housed either in informal settlements or in backyard structures. And the challenge is enormous. And at the moment, government is tending to pull back because of the general fiscus in South Africa from increasing subsidies into the housing sector.
Thanks. I think the challenge always is around this notion of progressive realization.
Yes.
So you can instantly stop evictions, but you can't instantly build millions of houses or create the opportunities for people to somehow access millions of houses. So both in any country, including Canada, there's always this width versus depth of housing policy.
Yes.
So who are you going to reach and how much you're going to spend?
Yeah. But I mean, I think that just on that, one of the issues that's risen in South Africa is that the Constitutional Court has ruled that where there are evictions, the municipalities are responsible for making sure, even if they're evicted by a private landlord, are making sure that they get decent accommodation, at least on a temporary basis. What this is doing is it's very difficult for the municipalities to service this particular need. And because of that, you're having increasingly complex situations around whether evictions go ahead, don't go ahead, particularly in some of the urban regeneration areas. It's making it very difficult to move on to do some of the development that needs to be done. So.
Great. Jeff, what do you think? I don't know if we've heard enough about the South African experience for you to reflect on what we might learn from it. But you might also talk more generally about how you think the progressive realization of the right to housing might start to be implemented in Canada, given that we've got different kinds of shortfalls related to income, related to Indigenous peoples, and so on.
Well, first of all, and I just want to first of all say thank you both Barry and Malcolm for the very excellent presentation. Always interesting to hear about differences, but also similarities between Canada and other countries, and clearly not just as a fellow Commonwealth nation, but with many similar structures. South Africa is a really interesting comparison. On this question of right to housing, of course, the Canadian folks on the call will know that Canada joined the very small club of countries around the world with right to housing legislation when our legislation got passed into law in June of 2019. So it's still a relatively new piece of legislation, and one that it'll take some time to really figure out how exactly it's going to be implemented and how it'll be interpreted. One of the big obvious differences between South Africa and Canada is that our law is not constitutional. It's not baked into the Constitution. Malcolm, if you are a Canadian politician in Canada and you promise to reopen the Constitution, you would likely not be elected dog catcher. It's that unpopular of a consideration. But we do have legislation that was passed. It's called the National Housing Strategy Act, Bill C-97, that was signed into law in June. It's a bit different than the South African example. First of all, the Canadian law is more of a collective right than an individualistic right at this point. It sets up two new accountability bodies whose mandate is really to protect and enforce and investigate any potential barriers to a collective right to housing. It does that through one new body called the National Housing Council, which will be a body of individuals, up to 14, I believe, who will serve essentially as an advisory body to the minister to identify any gaps or barriers at a collective level, at a policy level, to accessing housing. And then the second body is called the National Housing Advocate, which is an individual who will be supported by a team who has the ability to pursue investigations and inquiries into complaints, public complaints, can launch it proactively on his or her own behalf, again, investigating barriers to accessing housing. The limitation to that, not only is it done at a collective level, so for example, unlike in South Africa, where if there's a case of eviction, for example, then steps can be taken. The Canadian law wouldn't do that. It's, again, collective. And the other major limitation is that it's only applicable at a federal government level. So it has no bearing legally on either provinces, territories, or municipalities. I mean, those orders of government can look at any reports or investigations that any of these positions or the council or advocate take, but they're under absolutely no legal requirement to do anything about it. The other thing, and I think this is maybe more similar to South Africa, though, especially, Malcolm, you mentioned the Social Housing Act. Under our right to housing legislation, the government is required by law to develop and maintain a national housing strategy that has as its focus the most vulnerable populations. Now, of course, you can say, well, what does that mean? And, could a future government, essentially gloss that over? Yes, possibly, but it at least sets up a legislative framework whereby governments are required to develop and maintain, and also report and be held accountable using the metrics of indicators on the progression of that strategy. So it's at least another tool as we move forward to help protect, in particular, vulnerable populations who need that access to housing. But again, it's for us, unlike South Africa, it's so new. It was just introduced in June that neither the council nor the advocate have yet been appointed. And so we'll have to see how those play out. And the other thing that we throw out there is, how will the courts in Canada interpret it? It's too soon to tell, but I think it'll be an interesting thing to watch is how the courts interpret that law, and whether there'll be any outcome of any legal or court sanctioned action. So something to watch for.
Do you want to say?
Sorry?
Do you want to say anything?
No. I would be intrigued to see how some of these measures are going to work in the longer term, and to what extent they're going to be actually increasing access to housing for people, rather than merely pointing out where the gaps are, which is the big challenge that we have. We're very good at making wonderful, perfect policies, but we struggle much harder with the actual implementation of those particular policies. And so how we move from window dressing to real changes in people's lives is a big challenge.
Okay, I would just add, I think one thing South Africa took very seriously, and immediately after apartheid and for a number of years, was its reporting to the UN system on what it was doing around economic, cultural, and social rights. I think that's faded to some degree. And it's interesting, Canada, that at the federal level, at least,
yes,
the national level, there's going to be some reporting mechanism, because Canada has also reported to these same UN bodies, but they've never domesticated this stuff. So this new National Housing Strategy Act may open the door to domestication of the right and recourse around that right. But it's always been there in Canada. It's just harder because you have to drag it in through the courts.
Courts, yes.
And here the courts have been, when they are approached on housing issues, they've been very pro-poor and very
progressive.
Very progressive, remarkably so.
One other thing I would add is when CHRA made our various representations on this new law and we appeared before the parliamentary committees, one thing we asked for was a distinction within the law to account for Indigenous right to housing, for an Indigenous right to housing. We didn't get it in the law, at least not yet. And the reason was that we were told is because Canada had not yet adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. And Malcolm, for your benefit, there was actually a law tabled in Parliament for Canada to adopt UNDRIP. Unfortunately, right before our previous election, well, the election that just happened this year, there were some political shenanigans that took place in our Senate, and so the law was not passed before the election. The Prime Minister, our newly elected Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has promised to reintroduce UNDRIP, and so assuming that actually passes, and we're pushing parliamentarians to ensure it does, we're going to go back and revisit the law and recommend that distinct Indigenous right to housing is included, because at least then it would align with Canada's commitments under UNDRIP, again, assuming that it passed. So that'll be another, so this is certainly not sort of a done deal. It's going to be evolutionary, and that's the piece we'll be working on over the next couple of months and year.
Interesting to see how you can move it from being a notional right to a supported right, I suppose, a financial whatever. But
okay, I'm going to move on.
Right on.
Still in context. So I know from working with you that it's extremely difficult in South Africa to make the numbers work, given the subsidy levels of the National Social Housing Program and the kind of program details, unless there's also municipal participation, particularly in the large cities. And this is certainly similar in Canada. And what we've been looking for here is access to municipal land at below market value, reduced fees, speeded up processing, and so on. So can you tell us, as a national organization, what is NASHO doing to encourage municipal engagement with social housing?
Yeah, I think we've always found a bit of a mystery that our local municipalities are not more firmly brought in and engaged around the delivery of social housing, because within the Constitution and within all the legislation, they do have a strong developmental mandate, and social housing, I think, is an important spatial integration economic development program. So that's always been a mystery, but we at NASHO have been pushing this very, very hard over the last 6 or 7 years, and I think finally we're getting movement on it, because we have been asked now to start presenting some of the work that we've been doing on this, and we've had a huge amount of support from Rooftops on this through the Equal Spaces program. Is being presented at the policy forums, the national policy forums, where they're reviewing the approaches. And where we have been able to integrate and work much more closely with municipalities, particularly in Cape Town and again in Durban, it's remarkable how important those municipalities have become in the whole chain, and how, first of all, from a planning point of view, because we've got to find ways in which we use social housing and integrate it with the other planning strategies of municipalities. And there's a big emphasis in South Africa about densification, about strengthening public transport networks along densification routes. And so Treasury and a number of other government departments are putting increased investment. And then how do we put the social housing program as one of the investments within that framework is something we've been working on quite hard. And I think what we've discovered is that very often municipalities say they're wanting to do this, but because it hasn't been part of the South African delivery agenda for a long time. They're saying we don't know how to do it. And so one of the things we've done, particularly in Cape Town, to a lesser extent in eThekwini, is we've developed a whole set of methodologies, but also importantly instruments like municipal land pipelines, and I'll talk more about that in a moment, or the rationale for that. We've done partnership arrangements between SHIs and municipalities so that they can be a stronger link between the two, and the social housing institutions can be used as the delivery agents for the municipalities. We've looked with municipalities at what are the other incentives that they're able to give within their whole policy framework around rate rebates, building rebates, et cetera, that can make this more viable. But one of the critical issues is clearly around the question of and in the right place the objectives. And one of the things some of our research, which we did about 5 years ago, noticed that the government capital spending, although it was supposed to be spent in spatially well-located areas, was beginning to drift more and more to the peripheral areas. And part of that reason was because the amount of money in the grant which is allowed for land makes it impossible to make it work in well-located areas where there's a buoyant land market. And what was happening is the drift was being caused because that was the only place you could afford the land, and it was counteractive to the intention of the policy itself. And so we're, in our work with municipalities, are working ways in which government land can be released into social housing in the longer term, and that becomes a priority, the use of that government land for those purposes. And that's involved a huge amount of innovation, because many municipalities have up until now, when they've wanted to get rid of assets, just seen the major thing for them is to get as much money as possible. And so we've been involved in a number of projects and a number of court legal battles now around this very matter. So those are all things, but I just want to stress that part of the success that program has been the extra technical advice and assistance we've received via Rooftops.
Thank you.
Well, sorry, this is not to stroke the back of the chairperson, no.
Yeah, Jeff, I'm just a little bit of an intro, because I think the constitutional setup's a little bit different in Canada, because to a great extent, the provinces have control over housing policies. The federal government intervenes with funding, and then tries to reach agreements with provinces on what to do with the money. Whereas I think here in particular, with some recent changes in the social housing program, it's kind of de-emphasized the role of the provinces. So there's a more direct national to local relationship that's emerging. And we've been working hard to strengthen that, because where the money comes from is something called the Social Housing Regulatory Authority, which is not quite like our CMHC, but has some aspects of our CMHC in Canada, for Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So it may be that things can happen here that are more challenging in Canada if you're looking at things from a national perspective. So we're really putting Jeff on the spot by asking him, what is CHRA able to do or trying to do to support its members who are facing the same dilemmas and trying to build bridges with municipalities?
Yeah, and one of the really strong partners that CHRA has is the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, FCM, which represents, I believe, almost all municipalities in Canada. We actually just in the past couple months during the election campaign, we worked really close with FCM to align messages. And in fact, we're meeting with them again next week to do the same kind of in this post-election environment. I mean, every municipality, and I would add to that, every province and territory is at a different place in terms of their commitment to social and affordable housing. Clearly, FCM, for FCM, and I think for municipalities in general, social affordable housing has really risen up in the ranks in terms of priority issues. I would say for many municipalities, it's probably now their biggest concern, the biggest issue that keeps them awake at night. Prior to the release of the federal national housing strategy almost exactly 2 years ago, there were, of course, a number of municipalities as well as provinces and territories that had their own housing strategies. One thing that I've seen, and this is more anecdotal, but is when the national housing strategy was announced in 2017, it served as a bit of a catalyst. We saw more and more municipalities suddenly develop their own municipal national housing, or not national, but their own municipal housing strategies that was allied and complemented the measures in the national strategy. And of course, that's a positive thing because a lot of the measures in the national housing strategy were meant to be complementary to programs and policies that provinces, territories, and municipalities had in place. So from that perspective, it was a good, I think it sent a very positive and a strong signal to municipalities. I think the one concern that has been expressed, and I hear this more and more, especially as of late, is that the national strategy does rely in many ways on partnerships with municipalities as well as provinces and territories. Probably the best example of that is the co-investment fund, which, Malcolm, for your benefit, is a $14 billion fund that provides capital funding for both renewal and repair of existing units as well as new construction. In order to get, though, a contribution from this federal fund, you have to secure some form of contribution from either a municipality or the province or territory that you're in, which is okay. And I think that's, it's meant to be therefore incremental funding. The challenge we've been hearing from that, though, is the alignment, in particular, the alignment of timing with respect to when a housing provider would be able to receive these contributions. In many cases, we're hearing, a municipality or a province is kind of ready to go. The check is, almost ready to go out the door. But because CMHC or through this co-investment fund isn't yet ready, it means essentially people are having to sit around twiddling their thumbs until CMHC is ready to go. And so there's a bit of a misalignment that we're hearing between, what municipalities are ready to do and what CMHC or the federal government is. And that's a challenge. And we've raised that. And I think CMHC is working to try and speed up some of its approvals processes so that there can be greater alignment and complementarity between federal and or municipal programs, and ensuring that projects, aren't essentially sitting around gathering virtual dust. So yeah, I think there's clearly, because as Barry pointed out, municipalities are creatures of the province, and therefore there's not sort of a direct federal governance of them. It does mean that there's perhaps a bit more of a challenge in that relationship, but overall, whether it's federal, municipal, or provincial, territorial, I think the trains are all kind of going in the same direction, that everyone is very much on board with wanting to improve the state of affordable housing in Canada.
Yeah, Malcolm, you might want to say a word about the alignment issue, because one of the reasons the province's role in social housing is diminished is because of the provinces had part of the capital subsidy, and the, oops, I'm going to mute my phone, and the national government had another part of the capital subsidy, and it was a challenge, Jeff, getting these things aligned. So by cutting the province out, in effect, you have a direct relationship. And I guess the other important piece for Canadians is that local authorities here, the municipal level of government, is constitutionally recognized as one of the three spheres. You talk about levels, three spheres of government: local, provincial, and national.
Yeah, I think the issue is around the fact that we class our different levels of government, not levels, as spheres of government. And I think that there's a part of that the problems that have arisen from that is the confusion around responsibilities and accountability as well. So essentially in South Africa, the housing function rests with the provinces. However, the delivery function actually rests with the municipalities. But the municipalities often push back against this because they call it their unfunded mandate, because the money comes to them, but it can only come to them via the provinces. And sometimes the provinces choose to use that money on their priorities and disregard the municipal priorities, which is a huge tension. So what's happened now on the social housing program is the part which used to come from the province has now been combined into the national allocation, into a single allocation grant. And so the provinces have no financial interest in it. So they're less interested in becoming involved, and except in a couple of provinces where there's very strong leadership from officials who are very, very committed to it as a developmental program. And you find that more and more where social housing is successful, it's because on a programmatic basis, it's because the municipalities are investing in it and are, in return, there isn't the same as the financing system you were talking about earlier, Jeff, but there is the fact that if a municipality is able to leverage the social housing grant into their municipality, they're getting a government investment, which they would otherwise not get because it can't come through the province or whatever. So that alignment issue is, we're hoping that now with the new funding instrument that it's going to make it easier for delivery to happen in partnership at the local level. But there are tensions about it because some of the provinces are not wanting to have anything to do with it now because they said, you've taken our money away. So we're stepping out of it, and that's not a healthy sign either.
Yeah, we can't do that in Canada. We got constitutional issues.
Yes.
We'll talk about over dinner.
Yes.
I'm going to move us on a bit. With new social housing programs and funding in place, a key factor is making sure that the social housing sector has the capacity to develop and manage significantly more units. Existing social housing providers will have to scale up, and new ones will require support when entering the sector. So I'm going to flip this around. I'm first going to ask Jeff what CHRA is doing to make sure this capacity is in place, or what is CHRA involved in around this?
Darn, Malcolm, I was hoping you were going to take that one first, but no, I mean...
Good. I'm waiting. I'm wanting answers to this question because it's a huge challenge for us. So I listen.
And it's an equal challenge for us here in Canada as well. I mean, absolutely. You know, I think we're clearly on a growth curve in Canada, and so the question is, how do we scale up? How do we add capacity? How do we protect capacity? I believe that there's a fellow, Steve Pomeroy, who most Canadians know on the line, who's coined the term, you know, first do no harm when it comes to social housing, and we'd agree with that. It's really sort of an all of the above approach we're taking. I mean, first, on the advocacy front, we need to continue with the investments that have been made and ensure that they're able to be delivered more effectively. But especially now with the new government, we need to continue to press for additional capacity, particularly in supply of new affordable housing. The fact that we have a minority government that is, for all intensive purposes, going to be supported by the New Democratic Party, which has called for 500,000 new units of affordable housing, I think actually presents us with an opportunity to increase that supply. We also need to, you know, look at and support educational best practice measures that facilitate access to information and best case studies to providers across the country so that folks aren't having to reinvent wheels, and that we're able to look at new measures to increase both supply and capacity. We have a brand new, what's called Community Housing Transformation Center that CHRA had very aggressively lobbied for, and we got as part of the strategy. Their mandate is to provide both some resources and funding to enable individual providers, not just to scale up, but also to transform their operational models so that they can be more sustainable and viable into the future. And in fact, and I'm looking at Dominica, I believe it's December 4th that we're having a webinar on that new center so that providers can learn more how to take advantage. And then, it's the networking, it's the bringing people together that a national association like ours can do, to enable those sort of just organic connections between providers and other experts to help them, again, think of ways to scale up and to increase capacity. Here in Canada, I was just out a couple days ago in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where especially a lot of rural providers were saying, that's the boat they're in. They want to, excuse the pun, boat. They want to scale up, they want to grow, but they're not quite sure how. So, we're trying to facilitate some exchanges between them and some other providers across Canada. So yeah, Malcolm, we face definitely the same challenges. I'm guessing you do in South Africa on this. So it's certainly the thing that probably keeps us awake most at night is how do we, what role can we play to ensure that increase in both capacity and connection between our members can occur.
Malcolm, just to let you know, or Barry, you are muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
I see. It was from outside. We didn't realize that.
I think I did it before you did. It's Dominique, it's fine. Just do them so everyone else knows. Apparently there's feedback when we have the mic on here. So, and Jeff is speaking. Wanted Jeff, before Malcolm talks, I wanted Jeff to make Malcolm really jealous because my understanding is that community housing transformation center, have I got it right, Jeff?
That's right.
Is actually being managed by a consortium of housing sector organizations. Have I got that right?
That's
and
right.
There's like $60 million budget over how many years?
Over 10 years. So yeah, it was originally announced in the national strategy 2 years ago. At the time, in fact, it was the only measure in the national strategy that CMHC essentially issued an RFP. They are essentially contracted out the operation of the center. So that's right, a group of community housing associations, both nationally and provincially, including CHRA. We put in a bid, which we won, which was announced earlier this year. And since then, the new executive director and his team have been working to build the center. And on December 13th, they're going out with the first call for funding applications. So yeah, it's sector-led, definitely, with funding from CMHC. And it's got a really, I'll say it's got a really strong board. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on it, but despite me, it's a strong board. Who are from representative of providers from coast to coast. So I think that transformation center will be a really effective tool moving forward.
Okay, that's really got to be making Malcolm jealous because one of the big challenges I've observed here is getting that level of trust from government to sector. Malcolm, do you want to talk a bit about what the sector's trying to do?
God, I'm overcome with jealousy, so I'm not sure I can even say a word. No, I'd really like to hear about the date for that webinar. I'd be fascinated to actually to listen in. It's interesting that you mentioned Steve Pomeroy, and hello, Steve, if you're on the line, because Steve did a lot of work with us about 3-4 years ago around the financial social housing financial system, long-term financing system that we wanted to engage government about. And one of the things we did then was a trajectory of business trajectory for the development of social housing institutions in South Africa, which was a very useful piece of work and has informed a lot of the approaches we've made towards building that sort of capacity. However, it is one of the major challenges in South Africa at the moment. I mean, we're in a capital terms underspending on the capital budget available for social housing. And one of the major reasons is that we don't have the social housing institution business capacity to do it. And it's difficult because on the one hand, in South Africa, social housing is a very simple business if you look at the components of it and how the financing works, but it's a very marginal business, and you need a very good people, entrepreneurial people, I think, to be able to run social housing institutions successfully. And unfortunately, historically, the regulator who's been responsible for encouraging development in the sector has had a very loose approach to how they're going to develop that sector. So they've been doing a lot of what they call accreditation of new people into social housing. But these are people who are coming in and getting accreditation on the basis of tick boxes. And there's been no real substantial investment in building social housing businesses, non-profit, but businesses in a way, either in terms of long-term capacity inputs, nor in terms of financing inputs to help companies set up. So you've got I think we've got something like 84 accredited social housing institutions in the country, and we've only got 28 who actively have units under management. So we've been debating and discussing this with the Social Housing Regulatory Authority. And we think we've now got to the point where they've agreed that we're going to start a very small, in comparison with the sorts of things you're talking about, incubation program, which is going to be targeted at a much more systematic development of new business capabilities, while at the same time we continue to make sure that we've got the right sort of interaction and engagement with the already established companies. And, you know, we hope that that's going to start increasing, but it's a very, very slow job. I mean, it takes a social housing institution up to 4 years from the time they first sort of set themselves up before they've got their first income flows. And up to now, there's been just no investment in those companies other than what the people who are setting them up are bringing into it. And often for them, there's nothing that you're hardly going to bring in your own equity because you're not going to get a return on the equity. And you certainly won't get loan finance to do that sort of setting up because you're never going to have the margins in the running of the financial flows to be able to repay those loans. One of the problems about this at the moment, and it's a massive one, and I think we're going to reap some terrible sort of consequences in the future, is a increasing interest on the part of the Social Housing Regulatory Authority to engage with what they call ODAs, other development agents. And these are normally private for-profit companies who are coming in, bringing in land, not necessarily very well located land, fairly marginal, as part of their 20% equity investment in the project, and getting involved in doing the development. And for them, the tension we have about this is that we think it's too short term. It'll deliver the numbers, but in the end, it's not going to deliver the longer term management capacity around that stock. And our fear is that what we're going to have in 5 years' time are a lot of failed projects, and we are going to have to start major rescue missions, which will mean that you're going to have a strong non-profit sector to be able to do that. And although and within that particular framework, one of the other problems is that the government hasn't been very clear in defining to these private developers when it is that they can withdraw and how they withdraw. And I think many of them are walking around thinking that they're going to get a substantial windfall in 7 years' time because they'll be allowed to sell the stock. And when they envisage selling the stock, it's not as social housing stock, they envisage selling it as vacant occupation, really. So that's a huge tension. The lack of the non-profit capacity, SHI capacity, same time the desire of government to increase the numbers and therefore increasing engagement with the other development agents. But again, we've also got to find the sources of financing. I mean, the amounts of money you're talking about in the project, Jutta, is absolutely incredible. I mean, we are trying to get the Shah to release a tiny fraction of that for the incubation project. So that's another tension, is they aren't regular and proper streams of financing.
Great, Barry. Given that we have less than 10 minutes left, it's been a very informative and full webinar today. Maybe we should open up to some of the audience's questions, because I have a couple already who have typed in. And if any other people have questions, they can just type their questions into the question dialog box on the webinar control panel on your screen, and we can probably get to at least 2 or 3 questions before the end of today's webinar. So I'll get us started. And this first question, most of the questions are going to be towards Malcolm, just because I know Jeff speaks to this audience on a regular basis. So Malcolm, the first question is around the political shifting that has occurred in South Africa in the last couple of years, and if you see that as positive for the investment and delivery of social housing.
Thanks for that question. It's a very pertinent one at the moment in South Africa. I mean, I think a lot of people listening in will know that we've had a fairly turbulent time over the last 10 years, economically, with the high levels of corruption undermining a number of the critical government departments and government instruments. And I think a lot of that has been linked to strong infighting that's been going on, particularly within the governing party, the ANC, and different factions that have emerged there. And I mean, I think that at the election of our present president, Ramaphosa, it was seen as a time when maybe the ANC was going to be able to tackle firmly some of its internal struggles and start putting the country onto a better sort of footing in a way. And to an extent, there has been some progress in that, and things are beginning to look a little bit better, but those divisions within the ruling party are still enormous, and they're taking up a lot of the time and energy. So from a national point of view, it's highly problematic, and I think we're still sitting very much on the fence, and it's going to be, I think, very important to understand and see what direction happens in the next year and a half. In terms of social housing, I mean, the social housing has been fairly badly disrupted during that period, because the Social Housing Regulatory Authority for about 4 or 5 years was hardly functional. I mean, it also had severe cases of corruption in it, and interference from the governance, etc., which made it very difficult to play its role in the sector. And that was disturbing, because when it was set up, we had always thought it was going to be an important ability to stabilize and to give investment confidence, really, and that hasn't happened. I say that slowly it's beginning to rebuild itself and rebuild its role. So again, on that particular issue, I think we're still a little bit on the fence, but I have some optimism that we're going in the right direction at the moment. And so we'll see signs that this is going to improve the quality of institutional support and development in the sector.
Great, thank you so much, Malcolm. This next question, I mean, builds on that first question as well, and it's actually from Steve Pomeroy, and Steve says hi, and he says when he was in South Africa 4 years ago, NASHO had the aspiration to grow social housing to 200,000 by 2030, and he's asking, what are the prospects to accelerate that growth of the sector, seeing that currently it's at the 36,000?
Well, certainly there's a program to start increasing delivery, but again, I think many of the problems that we had when Steve was here have persisted in a way. And it's been very, very hard to convince government, which is the major funder and financier, either directly or indirectly, of different ways of actually doing things. So we're making marginal progress, but sadly, with Steve, we were working on what we called Vision 2030, which was based on a national document around the development of South Africa by 2030. And we had some very positive projections, and we also had some good clarity on what the institutional development we needed to do and the sort of financing that needed to flow. But I'm afraid up to now, these things have not come together. And at times, it's felt a little bit like we've been beating a drum in the wilderness, but I mean, I think beginning to now get some resonance to some of those things that we're talking about. But certainly we're not going to be able to achieve those targets. We're going to have to reduce them. But, you know, I think Nasha's perspective is that what we've got to do is we've got to spend time strengthening the institutional base. Because once you've got that much more strengthened, then the number of units that you can actually produce on a sustainable basis in a single year is going to increase. But I still think we need another 4 years to get that under very good conditions to get that base firmly established.
You know, can I just add one piece? I was going to add it before when Malcolm was when we were talking about capacity, but one of the things we've been working very closely together on is trying to develop the equivalent of the resource groups we used to have in the co-op housing sector and management companies, so that not every social housing institution has to do everything, but we can focus the capacity in those kinds of institutions. Resource groups, which would be groups of experts that are really can help social housing institutions do the development side, and then they can contract with management companies. And it's probably more realistic than expecting that every single social housing organization is going to develop those capacities in-house, and that may help accelerate things. I think on the positive too, Malcolm, my understanding is in the current 5-year funding framework, there is talk of 30,000 social housing units, so 6,000 a year. So maybe by 2030, we develop another 60,000 in the sector, which takes it to 100,000. So and I think if the sector starts to prove it has the capacity to grow, and it's been hamstrung certainly by some of the things you talked about, then maybe more money will be invested.
Been a fantastic conversation, and I think everyone who viewed enjoyed it quite a bit, or at least that's what I'm assuming in this virtual world. And I'd like to thank our speakers, Barry, Jeff, and Malcolm, and Barry for moderating today's session. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the audience for participating. Today's webinar has been recorded, and it's actually going to be shared on CHRA's website in the coming days. So you will also be emailed a survey about today's webinar that will help us here at CHRA plan future webinars. Our next webinar, like Jeff had mentioned, is scheduled for December 4th, and it covers the new Community Housing Transformation Center. With applications for funding through the center opening on December 13th, you're not going to want to miss this one, because there's going to be a lot of important information about those funding opportunities. And you can register through our website. Malcolm, I will send you the link. It's www.chra-achru.ca/webinars. So that's all for today, folks. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesdays.